The Second World War is often remembered as a clash of nations, ideologies, and massive armies, but behind the scenes, it was also a war of egos. And few rivalries were as intense, as personal, and as dangerous as the one between Hermann Göring and Adolf Galland. At first glance, they should have been natural allies. Göring was the head of the Luftwaffe, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, and a close confidant of Adolf Hitler. Galland, on the other hand, was one of Germany's most skilled and respected fighter aces, eventually becoming general of fighters. Both men were central to Germany's air war, but instead of cooperation, what grew between them was frustration, distrust, and eventually outright hostility. The conflict began during the Battle of Britain in 1940, one of the most critical air campaigns of the war. Göring was confident, overconfident, in fact. He believed the Luftwaffe could quickly destroy the Royal Air Force and clear the way for a German invasion of Britain. But Galland, who was actually flying missions and seeing the reality in the skies, knew things were not going as planned. German bombers were taking heavy losses. British radar systems, coordinated defenses, and resilient fighter squadrons made the campaign far more difficult than Göring had predicted. Galland tried to raise concerns, pointing out the flaws in strategy and the underestimation of the enemy, but Göring didn't want to hear it. He dismissed criticism and demanded results. At one famous meeting, Göring asked Galland what he needed to win the air war. Galland's answer was bold, almost sarcastic. He said, "I should like an outfit of Spitfires." He was referring to the British fighter aircraft, the Supermarine Spitfire, which he considered superior in several key aspects. The comment was both a critique of German equipment and a direct challenge to Göring's leadership. Göring was furious. To him, this wasn't just criticism, it was insubordination. From that moment on, trust between the two men began to collapse. As the war progressed, their disagreements only grew. Galland pushed for better aircraft, improved tactics, and more realistic strategies. He advocated for focusing on defending Germany from Allied bombing raids, especially as American and British bombers began devastating German cities. But Göring, increasingly disconnected from reality, continued to make grand promises to Hitler, promises that the Luftwaffe simply could not keep. One of Göring's most damaging claims was that no enemy bomber would ever reach Germany. But when Allied bombers began flying deep into German territory, destroying factories and infrastructure, that promise became an embarrassment. And Galland, once again, found himself caught between the truth and Göring's ego. By 1944, the situation had become critical. The Allies had gained air superiority, and German pilots were outnumbered, outgunned, and often flying outdated aircraft. Galland supported the use of revolutionary jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262, which had the potential to change the air war. But even here, Göring and Hitler interfered, insisting that the jet be used as a bomber instead of a fighter, wasting its true capabilities. Galland openly disagreed. He argued that the Me-262 should be used to intercept Allied bombers where it could be most effective. This disagreement wasn't just tactical, it became deeply personal. Göring saw Galland as a troublemaker, someone who questioned authority too often. Galland saw Göring as incompetent and dangerously out of touch. Eventually, the tension reached a breaking point. In early 1945, Galland was effectively dismissed from his position after openly criticizing Luftwaffe leadership. It was a dramatic fall for one of Germany's top fighter commanders, but it also showed just how toxic the relationship had become. And yet, Galland didn't simply disappear. He was later allowed to form a special unit of jet fighters, giving him one last chance to prove his ideas in combat. It was a small redemption, but far too late to change the course of the war. The rivalry between Göring and Galland reveals something deeper about World War II. It wasn't just about weapons and strategy. It was about leadership, pride, and the inability to accept reality. Göring's refusal to listen to experienced commanders like Galland weakened the Luftwaffe at a critical moment, and Galland, despite his skill and honesty, could not overcome the rigid hierarchy and ego-driven decisions above him. In the end, their conflict didn't just damage their relationship, it contributed to the failure of Germany's air war itself. If World War II proved anything, it's that even allies can become rivals when ambition, ego, and strategy collide. Nowhere was this more obvious than among the top Allied commanders in Europe and the Pacific, where personal grudges and clashing philosophies often ran just beneath the surface of cooperation. Few rivalries were as famous or as bitter as the one between George S. Patton and Bernard Montgomery. Both were brilliant commanders. Both were instrumental in defeating Nazi Germany, but they could not have been more different. Patton was aggressive, fast-moving, and believed in relentless attack. He pushed his troops hard and believed speed was the key to victory. Montgomery, often called Monty, was the complete opposite. He was cautious, methodical, and preferred overwhelming force before committing to battle. Where Patton thrived on risk, Montgomery avoided it. Their rivalry became especially intense after the Allied landings in Normandy in 1944, known as the D-Day. As Allied forces pushed into France, both generals competed for resources, supplies, and most importantly, credit. Montgomery often presented himself as the mastermind behind Allied strategy, which irritated American commanders. Patton, never one to stay quiet, saw Monty as slow and overly cautious. The tension reached its peak during operations later in 1944. Montgomery proposed a bold plan called Operation Market Garden, aiming to end the war quickly by capturing key bridges in the Netherlands. Meanwhile, Patton was rapidly advancing across France with his Third Army. He believed his approach, constant pressure on German forces, was more effective. Market Garden ultimately failed with heavy losses and missed objectives. For Patton and many others, this was proof that Montgomery's careful strategy could still lead to disaster. But despite the failure, Montgomery continued to receive significant support from higher command, further fueling resentment. And it wasn't just Patton who had issues with Montgomery. Arthur Tedder, a senior Allied air commander, also clashed with him. Tedder believed Montgomery often ignored the importance of air support and coordination, acting too independently. Their disagreements reflected a broader issue within the Allied command, different branches of the military struggling to work together under strong personalities. Meanwhile, another rivalry unfolded within American ranks, this time between Mark W. Clark and Harold Alexander during the Italian campaign. Clark, ambitious and highly concerned with his reputation, often prioritized capturing high-profile targets. Alexander, his superior, had a broader strategic view and sometimes found Clark difficult to control. This tension became clear during the Battle for Rome in 1944. Instead of fully committing to trapping German forces, Clark redirected his troops to capture the city itself, ensuring headlines and personal glory. While Rome was taken, many German units escaped, prolonging the campaign in Italy. It was a decision that historians still debate today, and one that highlighted the cost of personal ambition in wartime. Even within smaller commands, conflict was unavoidable. In the Pacific, Holland M. Smith and Ralph C. Smith became locked in a serious dispute during the Battle of Saipan. Holland Smith, a Marine general, believed Ralph Smith's Army units were advancing too slowly and not showing enough aggression. The disagreement became so severe that Holland Smith relieved Ralph Smith of his command, a rare and controversial move that sparked outrage within the Army. It exposed deep tensions between the U.S. Army and Marine Corps, even as they fought side by side against Japan. All of these rivalries point to a deeper truth about the Allied war effort. Victory did not come from perfect unity. It came despite friction, despite ego and despite personal conflict. Commanders argued, disagreed, and sometimes undermined each other, but they were ultimately fighting toward the same goal. Still, these tensions had real consequences. Delayed operations, failed plans, and missed opportunities often traced back not to the enemy, but to disagreements among leaders. In a war this massive, personality could be just as powerful as strategy. And in many cases, the battlefield wasn't the only place where battles were fought. On the Eastern Front, World War II reached a level of brutality and scale unlike anywhere else. Millions of soldiers, vast territories, and constant, relentless fighting defined this theater. But beyond the chaos of battle, another struggle was taking place, one between the very commanders responsible for leading these massive armies. Among the Soviets, one of the most intense rivalries existed between Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev. Both were marshals, both were highly capable, and both were trusted by Joseph Stalin. But that trust came with pressure and competition. Stalin often encouraged rivalry between his commanders. He believed it pushed them to perform better, to be more aggressive, and to deliver results faster. But it also created deep tension. Zhukov and Konev weren't just fighting the Germans, they were competing for recognition, for prestige, and for Stalin's approval. This rivalry became especially clear during the final push toward Berlin in 1945. Both generals were given commands of massive Soviet fronts and were ordered to advance toward the German capital. But instead of coordinating fully, they raced each other. Each wanted to be the one who captured Berlin, the ultimate prize of the war in Europe. Zhukov commanded the First Belarusian Front, while Konev led the First Ukrainian Front. Their paths converged as they closed in on the city. The competition was so intense that Stalin deliberately fueled it, giving both commanders overlapping objectives. It created urgency, but also chaos. The result was the Battle of Berlin, one of the bloodiest urban battles in history. Soviet forces suffered enormous casualties as they stormed the city. Zhukov ultimately took the central role in capturing Berlin, raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. Konev, meanwhile, was redirected south, cutting off German forces but missing the symbolic victory. For Zhukov, it was a moment of triumph. For Konev, it was a bitter outcome. And while both had contributed to victory, the rivalry left lasting resentment. On the German side, similar conflicts were unfolding, though often with even more damaging consequences. One notable feud was between Heinz Guderian and Günther von Kluge. Guderian, known as the father of Blitzkrieg, believed in fast, aggressive armored warfare. Kluge, more traditional in his thinking, often clashed with him over how operations should be conducted. Their disagreements weren't just theoretical, they directly impacted battlefield decisions. Guderian pushed for bold maneuvers and rapid offensives, while Kluge favored caution and consolidation. In a war where timing was everything, these differences caused friction and, at times, hesitation. But perhaps an even more significant rivalry existed between Erich von Manstein and Franz Halder. Manstein was widely regarded as one of Germany's most brilliant strategists, responsible for innovative plans like the breakthrough in France in 1940. Halder, as chief of the General Staff, held immense power over planning and operations. The problem was that Halder often resisted Manstein's ideas. Whether out of caution, pride, or simple disagreement, he delayed or blocked several of Manstein's proposals. This internal resistance slowed decision-making at critical moments. One of the clearest examples came on the Eastern Front, where flexibility and rapid response were crucial. Manstein frequently advocated for elastic defense, allowing Soviet forces to advance slightly, then counterattacking decisively. Halder, however, often pushed for rigid positions, influenced by Adolf Hitler, who increasingly demanded that no ground be given. These conflicting approaches created confusion and, in many cases, disaster. German forces found themselves trapped, overstretched, and unable to adapt quickly to Soviet offensives. The lack of unity at the top made an already difficult situation even worse. What makes these rivalries so important is not just the personal drama, but their real impact on the war. On the Eastern Front, decisions had massive consequences. A delayed order, a rejected plan, or a disagreement between commanders could mean the loss of entire armies. In contrast to the Western Allies, where disagreements were often managed within a cooperative framework, both the Soviet and German commands were shaped by pressure from above, whether from Stalin or Hitler. This pressure intensified rivalries, turning professional disagreements into personal conflicts. And in a war defined by its scale and brutality, those conflicts didn't stay in meeting rooms. They played out across entire fronts, influencing battles that would decide the fate of millions. In the end, the Eastern Front was not just a clash between two armies. It was also a battleground of egos, ambitions, and competing visions of how the war should be fought and won. In the Pacific, the war against Japan wasn't just fought across islands, jungles, and vast stretches of ocean. It was also shaped by a deep strategic rivalry at the very top of the American command. At the center of it were two powerful figures, Douglas MacArthur and Chester W. Nimitz. Both men were tasked with defeating Japan. Both had the full backing of the United States, but they had completely different visions of how the war should be fought, and neither was willing to fully give way to the other. MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, was driven by a personal mission. After being forced to retreat from the Philippines in 1942, he famously declared, "I shall return." For him, the liberation of the Philippines wasn't just strategic, it was personal, almost symbolic. His approach to the war focused on moving north through New Guinea and back into the Philippines step by step. Nimitz, on the other hand, commanded the Pacific Ocean areas and led the U.S. Navy's central thrust across the Pacific. His strategy focused on island hopping, capturing key islands, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions, and using naval and air power to cut off enemy supply lines. It was a methodical, efficient approach that relied heavily on the strength of the U.S. Navy. This created a split in the overall Allied strategy. Instead of a single unified advance, the United States effectively fought two parallel campaigns across the Pacific. Resources, ships, aircraft, and troops had to be divided between MacArthur's and Nimitz's commands. And behind the scenes, there was constant competition for priority. One of the biggest points of tension came over the question of the Philippines. Nimitz and many naval planners believed that bypassing the islands entirely might be the better option. Capturing Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, could provide a closer base for operations against Japan itself. But MacArthur strongly opposed this idea. He argued that abandoning the Philippines would be both strategic and a moral failure. The islands were still under Japanese occupation, and leaving them behind would damage American credibility. MacArthur took his case directly to Franklin D. Roosevelt, using both military arguments and political pressure. In the end, MacArthur won. The decision was made to invade the Philippines, leading to the massive Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944. It was a decisive victory for the United States, crippling the Japanese Navy. But it also reinforced the reality that strategy in the Pacific was not just about defeating Japan, it was about whose vision would shape the path to victory. While MacArthur and Nimitz maintained a professional relationship on the surface, the rivalry never truly disappeared. It was a quiet competition, fought through plans, priorities, and influence rather than open confrontation. At the same time, Another, more personal conflict unfolded involving MacArthur and Jonathan Wainwright. Wainwright had been left in command of American forces in the Philippines after MacArthur's evacuation. Outnumbered and undersupplied, Wainwright eventually surrendered to Japanese forces in 1942 after the fall of Corregidor. For the rest of the war, Wainwright endured brutal conditions as a prisoner of war. Meanwhile, MacArthur continued his campaign across the Pacific, becoming a national hero. But when the war ended and Wainwright was finally freed, tensions between the two men became evident. Wainwright felt that he had been placed in an impossible situation, left to hold out without adequate support. While he remained loyal publicly, there was a lingering sense that MacArthur had escaped while others were left behind to face the consequences. MacArthur, for his part, was careful in how he handled the situation. He publicly praised Wainwright and even supported him receiving the Medal of Honor. But the contrast between their wartime experiences, one advancing in victory, the other surviving captivity, created a quiet but undeniable divide. These conflicts highlight a key truth about the Pacific War. Victory did not come from a single unified plan. It came from competing strategies, strong personalities, and difficult compromises. The dual advance across the Pacific ultimately worked, but it was far from efficient, and it was shaped as much by rivalry as by coordination. In a theater defined by distance and complexity, even the highest levels of command were not immune to tension. And while the enemy was thousands of miles away across the ocean, some of the most important battles were fought much closer to home, inside the minds and ambitions of the men leading the war.
Not all rivalries in World War II were fought on the battlefield. Some of the most intense conflicts were driven by politics, ideology, and the question of legitimacy. Who truly represented a nation in its darkest hour? Few examples capture this better than the bitter divide between Philippe Pétain and Charles de Gaulle. At the start of the war, Pétain was considered a national hero. He had earned fame during World War I, particularly at Verdun, and was widely respected across France. By 1940, as German forces advanced rapidly during the Battle of France, the French government turned to him in desperation. What followed was one of the most controversial decisions in French history. As German troops closed in, Pétain supported an armistice with Nazi Germany. He believed that continuing the fight would only bring more destruction and suffering to France. The result was the establishment of the Vichy regime, a government that cooperated with the Germans and ruled over unoccupied parts of the country. To Pétain, this was a necessary compromise, a way to preserve what remained of France. But to others, it was betrayal. Among those who refused to accept defeat was Charles de Gaulle. A relatively unknown general at the time, de Gaulle fled to Britain and issued a call to resistance. From London, he urged the French people to continue fighting alongside the Allies. He rejected the legitimacy of Pétain's government entirely. This marked the beginning of a deep and personal conflict. Pétain saw de Gaulle as a rebellious outsider, a man without authority who was endangering France by prolonging the war. De Gaulle, on the other hand, viewed Pétain as a collaborator, someone who had surrendered not just territory, but the nation's honor. The divide between them split France itself. On one side was Vichy France, officially led by Pétain and recognized by some as the legal government. On the other side was the Free French movement, led by de Gaulle, operating from exile and gradually gaining support from resistance groups and allied powers. This wasn't just a disagreement over strategy, it was a fundamental clash of values. Pétain prioritized survival, even if it meant cooperation with Nazi Germany. De Gaulle prioritized resistance, even if it meant continued suffering and uncertainty. As the war went on, the consequences of Pétain's decisions became increasingly clear.
The Vichy regime cooperated with German authorities in multiple ways, including the deportation of Jews and suppression of resistance movements. What may have been framed as a protective measure began to look more and more like active collaboration. Meanwhile, de Gaulle's position grew stronger. As Allied forces began liberating French territory after the D-Day landings, Free French forces played a key role in the campaign. De Gaulle positioned himself not just as a resistance leader, but as the rightful voice of France. By the time Paris was liberated in 1944, the balance had completely shifted. De Gaulle entered the city as a symbol of French resilience and independence. Pétain, in contrast, was increasingly isolated and discredited. After the war, the rivalry reached its final stage, not on the battlefield, but in the courtroom. Pétain was arrested and put on trial for treason. The once celebrated hero of World War I now faced accusations of betraying his country. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment due to his age and past service. De Gaulle, now leading France, represented the opposite outcome. From exile and uncertainty, he had risen to become the head of the restored French state. His vision of continued resistance had ultimately defined France's role in the Allied victory. The conflict between Pétain and de Gaulle shows that war is not only fought with weapons, it is also fought with decisions, with beliefs, and with the courage or willingness to choose one path over another. In the end, both men claimed to act in the best interest of France, but history judged them very differently. One became a symbol of compromise and collaboration. The other became a symbol of defiance and national pride. And their rivalry remains one of the clearest examples of how, in times of crisis, the greatest battles are often over the soul of a nation itself.